And now we are recording as well. So welcome everyone, and thanks for attending Beer with a Biologist. This is our second event in the Bahia Grande series, and we will be hearing from Dr. Chris Gabler today. So I want to remind you really quick, you have been automatically muted and your video is turned off. It just makes it easier for everyone. Please put your questions in the chat. They will be answered at the end. I also have a few questions. I just want to hear from you guys and try to interact with you as much as possible. The presentation will be recorded, so make sure to check that out. I want to go over reminders and agenda, what I've just done. I will introduce myself as a co-host, our sponsorship, the Friends of Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge. In case you're not familiar with them, they're hosting this event, and our overall goals. And then I will give it to Chris Ada. We have two Chris's today, so that's not confusing at all. And he's a special co-host for the Latino Conservation Week, and he's going to give a good background of Bahia Grande. And then we will hear the presentation and have a question and answer section with Dr. Gabler, and then I will conclude this event. So lots to do, and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so quickly, my name is Melissa Ravel. I am one of the co-hosts. I am a AmeriCorps Volunteer in Service to America intern, so that's kind of a mouthful. So we are known as VISTAs with the Friends of Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge, and I'm focused on community engagement, fundraising, and planning programs, especially for underrepresented and low-income groups. And a special thing about this event is that we are sponsored by Padre Island Brewing Company, which is amazing. They actually they donated beer with me. So anyone that's drinking, cheers to you. I got some pale ale, so that's quite nice. In the chat, if you are drinking, just let me know what beer you're drinking or what is your favorite. I would love to hear it. And so just a bit about Padre Island Brewing Company. They are a great partner with the Friends of Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge, and they are a local company at South Padre Island, and they have amazing food and great drinks on tap. So make sure to check them out. You can learn more at pibrewingcompany.com or at 956-761-9585. And this is just a picture I took at Osprey Overlook with the growler they gave me, which I thought was pretty cool. So if you're not familiar, this event is hosted by the Friends of Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge, also known as FLANWR, and it is a 501(c) nonprofit established in 1997 with the purpose of protecting, supporting, and enhancing Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge. And if you want to learn more or volunteer or donate, you can always check out their website, which is savetexasocelots.com, or their fun Facebook page, which is Viva the Ocelot. And so the overall goal of the series is to increase awareness of the Bahia Grande unit of Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge and to fundraise for a new overlook. And this is a picture of Plover Point. And so the overlook will look similar to this. And we encourage you, if you are able to donate at texasocelots.com/Bahia-Grande. And make sure to check that out. That's the end of my part. And then Chris Q or Christopher Quezada, are you ready to share your screen?
I'm ready. I won't be sharing my screen, Melissa. You can leave this one on or my video.
Well, that's okay. We'll just do it like this for now.
All right. So thanks, Melissa. Thanks to the Friends of Laguna Atascosa, and thanks to SPI Brewing Company for making this event possible. Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Quesada. I am the Visitor Services Ranger at Laguna Atascosa. Just a quick recap on our last session. About Bahia Grande. Bahia Grande has gone through an intense change and challenges since the late 30s, the early 40s, and then throughout the 50s. primarily with the shipping channel that came in, that dredging project pushed soils, really changing the landscape of what the lower Laguna Madre looked like, the very southern portion of the Laguna Madre. Um, these soils, this dredging project pushed those soils, blocking off all water flows into the Bahia Grande. So for over 50 years, without tidal influx, the Bahia Grande began to dry. And then we had a lot of issues come up, issues like air quality, and that directly affected communities surrounding the Bahia Grande, to wildlife, to migratory bird species. We started seeing reduction in habitat. They were finding different places to roost, to migrate through, to nest. And then one of the big ones, which we don't usually, visually see, is what's under the water. So those seagrasses that were down there, they're major nurseries. Even now, they're great nurseries for fish populations. So we lost a lot of that. Approximately the Bahia Grande unit, the wetland itself is 6,000 acres. And then in addition with the other wetlands that surround it, it's about 7,000, 7,500 acres. So that's a lot of habitat to lose. So for those 50 years, all the way to the late 90s, or actually early 2000s, we had that was missing. So in the late 90s, the Fish and Wildlife Service acquired the Bahia Grande with we have land acquisition monies. And then in the early 2000s, can you hear me?
Yes, we just lost you for a second, but should be good now.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. So in the late 90s, the service got that land. And then in the early 2000s, over 60 partners came together to find a solution for Bahia Grande. So in 2004, the service and those partners, they found a solution. They dug a pilot channel that connected the shipping channel and the Bahia Grande together to restore some of those hydrologic flows back into the Bahia Grande. And then in a matter of months, you could actually go out there, you could witness bird species returning, roosting, nesting, and moving throughout their migratory routes. Now, one of the big things to highlight is that while bird species were returning and we could see, hey, the life is coming back to Bahia Grande, we couldn't see what was happening underneath. And the ecosystem, even now, is still unbalanced. The wetland itself has not gone a full restoration process. Uh, the recovery of these seagrasses after 18 years of having Bahia Grande have water is still not complete. You can actually go on Google Maps now and you can see the difference in color because the seagrasses are missing from the Bahia Grande to South Bay to the Laguna Madre. I mean, it's a very drastic difference there. So this ecosystem requires, pristine conditions for the seagrasses to successfully propagate. And currently we have a number of issues. One of the big issues is that we don't have the proper flows going in there. Again, that pilot channel that was dug is very, very.
Oh, we may have lost him again. Chris Q, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so that pilot channel is very narrow. So those titles, you get ebb tide, your different tidal influxes throughout the day. Those they don't reach the very back of the unit. There's also a old railroad trestle right in the middle that kind of prevents that from cycling the way it's supposed to cycle. And then we also have other issues like climate change. And these issues, they're not just being addressed by the service. Thankfully, we have a lot of great partners. We have great organizations, and we have individuals like Chris Gabler, who is here with us today.
Chris Q, can you hear me? Okay.
Hello?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. So I was saying we have great partners, great organizations that are helping this service in restoring the Bahia Grande. People like Chris Gabler from the University of Texas at Rio Grande Valley. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Dr. Gabler if he's ready, and I'll stick around this program. If you guys have any questions, I'll answer them in the chat box.
Thanks, Chris Q. Dr. Gabler, are you ready? Dr. Gabler, can you hear me? I have his video, but I don't have his audio, so I can't hear Dr. Gabler right now. Let's see. Let's see if I can just give us a few seconds just to see. Let me send him a message and see what we can do. Okay, I think he is. I see him on my screen, so hopefully he can bring up his presentation soon.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, but we
Sorry, guys. Critical internet failure at a most inopportune time in the history of presentations. Hopefully, I come back soon. I'm on my cell phone right now using my wireless. So I'm pulling my talk on this now. It looks like I may be able to join on my. I'm going to be on as two people now. If I can join you.
Yes, that's fine. I will.
Great. Okay. Looks like it's working on my computer again.
Okay.
So let's do that. That's much easier.
Yeah, I'm trying to make your computer one, then be a co-host again.
Okay. Let me swap here.
Thank you everyone for holding on. Sometimes, technical difficulties happen, but just how it works. While we wait for, oh, you ready to go?
I think so. Sorry about that. This is much better for me than trying to do it from my phone.
Yeah,
okay.
Definitely.
Are we ready? I'm limiting factor here, huh?
That's okay. Go ahead. Once you're ready, go ahead and get started.
Oh, now that my internet is back on my laptop, I'm good to go. So let me share my screen. All right, can you hear me still with this now shared? Great. Okay. Well, I missed actually 100% of what Chris said, but I'm sure it was fabulous. And I want to thank him and everybody else for this opportunity. I really enjoy the chance to give non-technical talks and ones that are a bit more lighthearted. So thank you to the friends for inviting me to do this, and thank you to everybody for coming and listening. Appreciate your patience right now, especially with that new record in critical internet failure at worst possible time. Okay, so let's jump right in so I don't use up all of any spare time I had. So this talk is going to be focusing on coastal wetlands, and I want to sort of begin by painting a brief picture of what these habitats are for anybody who's unfamiliar. And so first, being coastal, they occur where the land meets the sea. And in particular, they occur in the intertidal zone, which is depicted here in this picture. So basically, coastal wetlands occur in land that is covered by water at high tide, but are above the shoreline at low tide. Okay, and there's some wiggle room. Okay, and forgive me if there's a bit of a delay between the slide transition. That is often the case when I have high-res photos. Okay, so coastal wetlands occur all over the world in hot and cold and wet and dry environments, and the particular species that define a coastal wetland will differ between different regions, but they're all characterized by one or more of the same 4 functional groups. Okay, and here they are. Graminoids, which are herbaceous plants, this is at the top left, in the grass or sedge or rush family. Mangroves, top right, which are trees that have special adaptations to wet and salty environments. Succulents, bottom left, which have fleshy leaves or stem, so you can sometimes have woody stems. They're the most salt tolerant of the true plants, at least that we normally see in coastal wetlands. And finally, not really a plant group, but the unvegetated areas, which can be mudflats or algal mats. And then within a particular geographic region, and even across small distances, the relative proportions of these 4 functional groups can be very different. And this is important that they correspond to different environmental factors like climate and salinity. So again, this is an important thing to think about, and we're going to focus on this later on. Okay, so the first of the functional groups, we're going to look now at specific examples of this in our part of the world. So in South Texas, coastal wetlands are actually very diverse, and we have some of all 4 of these functional groups. So here is some smooth cordgrass from Laguna Viscosa. This is actually the least common of the 4 functional groups that we have in South Texas. Most of our parts of the coastal wetland area is too dry or salty for graminoids to really do well. And where they can grow, because we have such little frost, they tend to be outcompeted for space by mangrove trees. And nevertheless, they do occur, but they're usually found in relatively small patches, and they're usually in tidal waters that are slightly deeper than mangroves can handle. So you'll often see like a really thin fringe on the shore side of mangrove forests. So then mangroves are a very common functional group here in South Texas. These are good old black mangroves from Laguna Viscosa. And these often dominate areas that either get a relatively large amount of freshwater inflow or they're regularly flooded by tides. And both of these, importantly, are what keeps soils from becoming too salty. Salt doesn't accumulate there. And black mangroves like these are the only species of mangrove that would naturally grow in Texas. And that's because it's the most frost tolerant. Again, we'll get into that important feature a little bit later. Eventually soon, I think we're going to start to see red mangrove. And then there are 2 other species that occur in North America. The third group are succulent plants. Again, this is pretty common locally. Succulents dominate in areas where soils are saltier than where mangroves dominate, and they'll often fringe stands of mangroves where tidal patterns cause salt to accumulate on one side or the other, but not too much, okay? And importantly, fun fact, most of the most common succulents in our part of the world are edible raw, right? So they have fleshy leaves that you can eat, like the saltwort that's pictured here. That's the more yellowish one to the right. Also sea purslane, which has a really distinctive red to purple stem, but they're very salty. So again, on the beer theme, I would recommend you pair this with a light Mexican beer that's often served with salt, or tequila if you've got lime to spare as well. So good stuff. Sea purslane tequila, can't go wrong. It's the beach meal. Oops, too many slides. All right. Then the fourth group, again, the kind of a group, are the algae mats. And these are also quite common in South Texas. And we're unique in South Texas because this is the only part of the Gulf Coast where algal mats are relatively abundant and widespread. And this is mainly because we are the region of the Gulf Coast that has the lowest rainfall. And these mats occur where the soils are the saltiest. They get too salty even for succulents to grow. Now, this does not mean that they're lifeless, desolate areas. These mats are photosynthetic, and they can become several inches thick, as you can see here. And this means they're primary producers. And so they're therefore the foundation of their own unique and interesting food webs. Now, not surprisingly, they aren't going to be as productive as a mangrove forest, but it's something, and they add to our local biodiversity, and they're pretty unique and cool for those reasons. Okay, so why does this matter? Why should anyone care about coastal wetlands? And we're going to talk more about this later, but I'll conclude the sort of first part by pointing out that coastal wetlands provide very many highly valuable ecosystem services. Coastal wetlands provide us with storm protection, they reduce erosion, they remove and they break down solid waste from water, they provide key wildlife habitat, they support commercial and recreational fisheries, they catch and remove various pollutants from surface waters. They support local recreation and ecotourism industries, which is a very big deal here in the Valley, as you guys all know. And they capture and store more atmospheric carbon than any other ecosystem on Earth. So very valuable. They're important. We need them. All right. Now, even though the main focus is on aspects of climate change beyond sea level rise, in many ways for coastal wetlands, sea level rise is definitely the elephant in the room. And so it's worth discussing, and even in a short talk like this, and even though I've already eaten up a lot of any time I had to spare. But I'm going to briefly cover the basics as quickly as I realistically can. So by the end of this century, we expect, and I'm going to gloss over for kind of the rest of my talk. I'm going to show some relatively complex figures and charts, but I'll kind of point you to the key features. So just bear with me, please. So by the end of this century, we expect that sea level is going to have risen approximately 30 to 85 centimeters, or about 1 to 3 feet. And our best guess is that it's going to be closer to about 50 centimeters, or just over 1.5 feet. And these overall predictions are represented in this figure by those gray boxes. And it's a box because there's uncertainty, so it's error bars. The prediction is somewhere in that range. And there are many factors that go into all of these predictions, things like thermal expansion of ocean water and different ice sheets melting, and each of those have their own level of uncertainty. And that's what's represented by those crosses underneath the gray boxes. And each cross denotes a particular prediction with its own margin of error, okay? Now, why are there so many sets? All of this depends on us. That is, what are we going to do about it? How is humanity going to respond to this big threat? So each gray box and each set of crosses is really representing one different scenario where humanity does a better or a worse job of reducing greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. So RCP at the bottom stands for representative concentration pathway. That's IPCC lingo for kind of like different paths humanity could take in the near future. And it has to do with how much greenhouse gas is in the atmosphere. Bigger numbers are worse, more greenhouse gas. And so I've drawn this average human to scale with a red box for each of these cumulative average predictions to illustrate this change. And I added a dog with a snorkel to remind everybody that it's not all about us. We are not the only species at risk from this, and many species are at much greater risk than we are. We're a resilient species that shapes its environment. Not lots of things are at major risk of extinction. So longer term, things are looking even more dire. Here are 3 sets of predictions that go as far as to the year 2500. Again, each with individual factors shown by different colored vertical bars. So pay attention to the solid red bars to the right, which are the sums of those other factors. And again, with a lot of uncertainty for each of those factors, the total bar is a wide range. But this is still very useful and predictive. Again, there are different emission scenarios, low, medium, and high, represented by the bottom, middle, and top box. And I've again added an average human to show the scale of these predictions for each scenario. That top one is not a mistake. That human is that small. Some of these predict sea level rise approaching 7 meters or over 21 feet. Okay. So the low scenario is not much worse than what we saw by 2100 in the last slide. In the medium scenario, we could realistically see major disruptions and heavy damage to our current coastlines all around the world. And in the high scenario, well, the very shape of our nation could change dramatically with pretty catastrophic coastal impacts globally realistically happening. Of course, there's time for us to deal with that, but it takes a long time to move cities from a coast, and lots of people live very close to the coast. But again, different emission scenarios, totally different potential levels of catastrophe. So how bad this is going to be for our descendants, and it'd be great to live for 500 years, maybe not so great depending on how things are going. How bad it could really become really comes down to how much greenhouse gas is in the atmosphere. And that medium scenario starts at 500 parts per million. So where are we now? Top right-hand corner has the most up-to-date recent global monthly CO2 concentrations. So as of April 2020, we were at 414 parts per million. That's up from 411 this time last year, which is an increase of 3 parts per million in 1 year. That's a lot. Well, what about all the work that different countries are doing to cut their greenhouse gas emissions? You know, surely this isn't part of a longer term trend, right? You know, we have the Paris Accord and Kyoto protocols and all these different things. Well, the figure right below that shows that this is definitely a trend. CO2 has been steadily increasing for as long as we've been measuring it. And it's gone up 80 parts per million in the last 40 years. And at this rate, we'll get up, you know, and it's 80 years till 2100. In that time, we could go up another 160 parts per million, which would put us closer to 600 parts per million, which is right in the middle of the medium scenario and ignores the potential for runaway greenhouse effects, where we begin to trigger things like permafrost melting and releasing extreme amounts of CO2 and frozen CO2 or CO2 stores below ground capped in ice that then gets released when ice melts. That's a rabbit hole of scary stuff that we're gonna wait on for now. So, okay, CO2 is increasing, but change takes time, right? And at least the rate of increase must be going down with all these laws we're passing internationally. And eventually it's gonna stop increasing and it's gonna start to decrease, right? I hope so. Not yet. Please direct your attention to the bottom right-hand panel. The rate of increase is going up still. Things are not looking super good for our middle scenario. So those horizontal bars are 10-year average rates of increase, right? So 2 parts per million a year. We might be exceeding that now. We were from 2019, 2020. Okay, so let's look at what this means locally. There is a really handy sea level rise mapping feature on coast.noaa.gov. Here is our current sea level. The areas shaded in green are waters that are not tidally connected, but are fed by groundwater, as far as I understand it. So these, I'll talk through that when we see changes there. Here's a 1 foot increase, and the areas shaded in light blue are things that have now flooded. And you see a lot of change in South Bay. Can you see my mouse?
Yes.
Okay, great. So a lot of change here in South Bay and a lot of change over near San Martin Lake. We see sort of otherwise a lot of eroding of really low-lying areas, some of the preserves on South Padre Island, and eating away of these low-lying areas, which are a lot of our marsh and mangrove habitats. 1 foot is the best case scenario for this century. In fact, that best case scenario, I didn't mention it before, that is 0 additional carbon added to the atmosphere, as in we stop burning gas tomorrow. Not reduce it, no more increase, no more carbon in the atmosphere. And things will still increase and still get warmer and still sea level rise. So this is just the beginning. 2 feet is sort of the high end of what's likely this century, sort of the 60 centimeter range. Here we see the same pattern as before. Our low-lying areas have been flooded. That expands even more than before. We're starting to see significant inflows into areas that are protected, have protected shorelines, like around Port Isabel, okay? And more of those coastal wetlands are now submerged. They would become great seagrass habitat, but we'd lose the seagrass that are now too deep. So not a great news any way you want to slice it. Here's a 3 foot or 90 centimeter increase, and this is kind of the best case for our long-term projections, okay? Could very realistically happen in the not so distant future. And this is about the best we could hope for over the next couple hundred years. I think within a few hundred years and this much change, we could realistically cope and make amends, but it's still asking a lot. That's still a lot of wetland loss quite soon. Here's a 6 foot change, and this is when things really start to look dicey. Again, this is less than a third of what it could potentially be under some high emission scenarios. Let me direct your attention to what's going on in Port Isabel and South Padre Island. I mean, this is a different world. This much change is likely in some of the long-term scenarios in some of the long-term medium scenarios. So this is very realistic. Now remember, as much impact as this is going to have directly on humanity, this is flooding and out our coastal wetlands. But wetlands exist in the intertidal range. So wherever the sea level is, there will be an intertidal range, and there could potentially be coastal wetlands there. However, we have created an awful lot of barriers to wetland migration, and this is also happening very fast. So the big problem is that these habitats could migrate landward upslope in a historical time frame. This sea level rise is happening way faster than it's ever happened before, and we've built all sorts of levees and seawalls and homes and hotels and dikes and roads and bridges that will block the plants from migrating upslope. So this is a major part of the threat of sea level rise to our coastal wetland habitats. Coastal wetlands will still exist, but they're going to have a hard time migrating. And to sort of point out the red text at the bottom, this is one of the key reasons natural areas like Bahia Grande and all of our regional refuges are so important, and it's because they lack these migration barriers. These are going to literally be refuges for the last remaining coastal wetlands.
Dr. Gabler, can you hear me? You froze on me, so.
Having on plant community structure. So this is things like the changes in temperature and rainfall. We know that climate governs plant distributions. Anyone who's a gardener knows this well. Anyone who's visited different parts of the world knows this. The classic figure at the top left here is the Whitaker biome diagram. Some kinds of habitats live where it's warm and wet. Others, you get deserts where it's warm and dry. Tundra where it's cold and dry. And these climatic factors, temperature and rainfall, also vary predictably along physical gradients. It gets colder closer to the poles, you get drier as you get further away from the coastline. And this is true globally and it's true locally. Like we see these patterns in Texas. It gets colder from north, warmer as you go south in Texas, and drier roughly as you go to the east in Texas. And you see this transition in habitat types. And similar stuff happens as you go up in elevation. So this is true for all plant communities, and it's also true for specifically coastal wetlands and the types of coastal wetlands that we see all over the world, as well as here in South Texas. And so you can see where it's wet and hot, we tend to get mangrove forests. Where it's cold and dry, we tend to have herbaceous salt marshes, and then all sorts of things in between. Now, the Gulf Coast has a pretty broad climate range. Even though the Gulf Coast is hot and relatively wet, there's a lot of variability within. It's a fabulous natural laboratory for testing this kind of question. And this is our key question, is how are these changes in temperature and rainfall that are happening with the same climate change that's driving sea level rise. You know, we've been focusing on that. But what about the rest of it? What's going to happen to the coastal wetlands that still exist? How are they going to be changed by these corresponding changes in temperature and precipitation? And that's what we set out to do. And to do this, we had to collect a lot of data over the entire Gulf Coast range. And so we had 10 study sites, 10 major estuaries that represent a broad range of temperatures and precipitations. South Texas is relatively hot and the driest of the sites. As you go clockwise around the Gulf Coast, you get cooler and wetter in Texas. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama are the coldest and the wettest. And then in Florida, it's pretty wet, but it's also the warmest, even warmer than in South Texas and parts of these. So then at each of these estuaries, we positioned a series of transects to capture sort of local scale variability. Things like salinity vary a lot within an estuary, and that has a huge effect on what plants are growing where. So we had to factor in this as well to kind of tease apart salinity effects from climate effects. And then there's even other local things that affect this. So along our transect, we followed elevation so that and elevation is particularly important, so that we could, again, tease out local effects like elevation, soil differences, things like that, to really say what is a change because of climate versus these other environmental factors. And so we collected data from 10 estuaries, 70 different transects, 1,020 plots, looking at soil physical chemistry, elevation, and then a lot of details on the actual plant community structure. And again, for this first part, we're only going to focus on the functional groups. We have species level data, but again, we're just drawing broad strokes here, big patterns over large spatial scales. So we're going to concentrate again on these 4 functional groups, which are really important because these are foundation plant species. They're dominant over large spatial scales. They are the basis of food webs for these entire ecosystems. They're important things. So not surprisingly, and as one might expect, especially if you're well-traveled around the Gulf Coast, we saw that graminoids in blue were most common where it's cold and wet, and least common in places like South Texas, which were hot and dry. Hot and dry South Texas also had the most unvegetated areas. These are including those algae mats. And as we moved up the Texas coast, we started seeing less unvegetated land, fewer mangroves, and more grasses, and quite a few succulents along the way. Just that's kind of unique and special to Texas. And then in the Everglades, again, mangrove dominance, but in some parts of the Everglades, we see some grass dominance as well, just because Everglades are this cool system that have these cool grassy areas. So we then took the data from this and we put it into a model, and we looked at how at and at this point, every one of these points is a single estuary. So each triangle or diamond or circle is representing like Laguna Madre or Baffin Bay or the Everglades or Tampa Bay, whatever. And we found that there were some really specific non-linear patterns associated with these changes, okay? Non-linear is very important because it means that there's not a gradual increase or decrease in some of these functional groups as climate changes. It means there's a threshold where beyond that point, big changes happen quickly. And the best example of this are mangroves and graminoids. So this graminoid curve goes down quickly as you reach this low, as minimum temperature increases. So this is one of several metrics of how intense are winters, and it reflects frost stress because mangroves can't tolerate frost. And with this, opposite to this, is this threshold increase in mangrove dominance past the same kind of inflection point. So you reach this threshold of severe winters, and all of a sudden, mangroves start to dominate and grasses start to become more and more rare. We see a similar pattern, well, we see different patterns, but again, nonlinear with precipitation. If you include grasses and mangroves together, we see that this also follows a sigmoidal S-shaped curve that goes up as you increase in precipitation. There's a hump-shaped curve, a unimodal curve for succulents, they tend to have their peak around 1,000 millimeters of rainfall a year, and then less at lower rainfall, less at higher rainfall, because where it gets wetter, grasses and mangroves take their place, and where it gets drier, it becomes unvegetated, which is this yellow line, which is highest at the lowest end. Again, all of this is intuitive. This is all what you would expect to see looking at these these coastal wetlands around the Gulf Coast. And here we're looking just at vegetation height. There's this big swing, this big increase as mangroves, as you transition from grass to mangroves and things get big. And with the change in temperature, and also a similar change with precipitation. But I don't want to worry too much about height. Suffice it to say that things get bigger when you transition from grass to mangrove, and you can have a 4-fold increase in height, whether you're going from 20 centimeter grass to 80 centimeter grass, or a 4-foot mangrove, a 4-meter mangrove tree to a 16-meter mangrove tree, based on how much rainfall you get. So mangroves in South Texas are pretty short. Mangroves in South Florida are very tall for exactly this reason. Okay, so don't worry about the math here. To sort of clarify what's going on, each of those curves, each of those lines, the different colored lines, has an equation associated with it. And using some math, we were able to combine the equations to say what's going to happen when you vary both of these at the same time. And so we created a model that had 2 variables, a bivariate model that looked at both temperature and rainfall. And then once we had those equations, which are the 2 at the bottom, which are actually combinations of the ones above it, you can then solve it. You can then say, okay, for all these different ranges of temperature and rainfall, what do these equations predict are going to be the dominance of different functional groups? And then when you have that, you have this spreadsheet with a whole bunch of answers, which is actually a relatively straightforward thing to do in Excel, all this solving. And then you can create some cool maps using some code. And I did this in R to create these contour plots to illustrate the differences in the predicted functional groups across these relevant ranges in climate. And here they are. So again, not a big surprise. Ooh, am I drawing this? I didn't mean to. How do I?
You can erase it in the top, but otherwise it doesn't take away from your presentation. I don't see. It's just off the side, so don't
I
worry
did
about
turn
it.
on draw. Let me clear it. Oh, I hope that would work.
Oh. Yeah, it's not quite.
Maybe somebody else did that. No big deal. Okay, so here we see graminoids. Again, they're dominating at the wettest, coldest areas. Mangroves are dominating at the wettest, warmest areas. But here, again, this isn't a surprise. And the old joke about ecologists thoroughly proving things everyone already knew is kind of true here. We knew these were the species that were going to dominate in these areas, but now there's math behind it and there's specific predictions. And you can lump, and here again, here's succulents in black, unvegetated. You can put all this together, and I'm going to speed up here because I know I'm using up my time. And you can put it all into one figure like we do over here to the right. There we go. Got rid of it.
Oh, good.
All right.
Yeah, someone had a comment to suggest getting rid of it, so.
I tried to before. I had to use a different option. There was a drop-down box where I could clear everyone's drawings. I didn't know that was there. Okay, so this figure on the right is the combination of all the different functional groups. And so you could sort of say, I live in a place that has 1,100 millimeters of rainfall and a minimum surface temperature of -4. And you could find that on this plot and have a specific prediction as to what a coastal wetland in that climate would be in terms of how much mangrove, how much graminoid, how much succulent, and how much unvegetated. And that was a powerful tool that allowed us to then model what we thought was going to change in the future based on published IPCC climate scenarios. So here are what we call climate envelopes for different regions of the Gulf Coast. So the rectangle represents the range of temperature and precipitation we see in these different rectangles that represent the climate zones of the Gulf of Mexico coast. So Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Northwest Florida, warm, coolest and wettest is up here, dominated by grasses. That's exactly what we see. Great agreement between our models and these climate our climate envelopes as well. So let's focus on South Texas, okay? Here we are, the driest and relatively warm. And as you can see, we have some succulents. We have a mix of mangroves, a few graminoids, and a fair bit of unvegetated land. Agreeing, again, very well with what we see locally. It's always good when your models reflect what the real world, what you'd expect to see. Okay, so now it's very easy to just shift these and say, well, if the temperature goes up and if rainfall changes, it's very easy to shift these climate envelopes. And now you can see these boxes have moved, and now you can say, okay, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Northwest Florida now are going to be a mix of mangroves and graminoids, and they're going to have fewer of both and possibly more succulents. A place like, so the sort of turning point for mangrove dominance is Central Texas coast, sort of Corpus Christi, Mission Aransas part of the world. So that's Central Texas. Northeast Texas would be a place like Galveston Bay. With this change, Galveston is starting to look like Mission Aransas or Corpus Christi. And this is a conservative estimate, 2 degrees warmer, 10% less rainfall. A more realistic increase in temperatures, 4 degrees Celsius. And now Northeast Texas is looking like Central Texas. In my children's lifetime, hopefully, fingers crossed, right? They're going to live that long. Galveston Bay, which is where I grew up fishing, is going to look like, it's going to be full of mangroves. I can't sort of overemphasize how big of a change this really represents. And there are lots of parts of the Gulf Coast that are this way. Because of this nonlinear relationship, because there's that threshold temperature where mangroves begin to dominate, large regions of the Gulf Coast are likely to change from grass dominance to mangrove dominance. So South Texas is going to shift well into the mangrove world. It already was pretty much there, but we're going to lose the bit of grasses we have, and we're likely to see a decrease in the amount of succulents we have, a decrease in the amount of mangroves we have, and an increase in the amount of unvegetated land. Maybe 20%. Let that sink in. 20% less plant matter, 20% fewer areas with trees and succulents. These are the foundation of our food webs. 20% less vegetation means 20% fewer animals, fewer fish, fewer birds, fewer everything. That's a big deal. Because we're on the dry side, and we're arguably one of the areas at the greatest risk in terms of sort of health and wealth of any part of the Gulf Coast. Okay. So the Gulf of Mexico is not the only part of the world that's facing these kinds of changes. So areas that are circled in blue have an aridity gradient, like that has that vegetated to unvegetated transition. Okay, from some plants to either more succulents or fewer plants altogether. And areas circled in red have that winter air temperature gradient, which is the marshland versus mangrove transition. And areas in purple, including the Texas coast, have both of these things going on, okay? So this is a global phenomenon, and what's happening in South Texas is literally bellwether for what's happening around the world. As South Texas goes, so will most of the world, at least these coastal areas that we're looking at. So what are some of the impacts going to be? And we're going to focus locally again. How is this going to affect us? And why should everybody care? So there's some uncertainty, and I'll briefly mention there's some uncertainty about the direction that rainfall is going to go in South Texas. But basically, whatever happens, it's probably going to get drier. Even if we get a little bit more rainfall, it's going to get warmer, which means there's going to be more evaporation and more transpiration. There's also a lot of growing municipal demand. The Rio Grande Valley is one of the fastest growing regions in the US. That means more people. They need more water for their houses and their yards and whatever. Arguably, growing agricultural demand really depends on sort of market forces, but we already draw a ton of water for irrigation, and that may go up especially because we have higher population locally. And they're going to be one thing all the climate models agree on is fewer but larger rainfall events. And when that happens, you have more runoff. There's less absorbed by terrestrial soils and plants. More water could reach Laguna Madre for this reason, which may reduce salinity, but it's historically been hypersaline, which means that there would be a change in that regard. And that would mean more water stress between rainfall events because plants go longer between getting any rain. So drier is our outlook. So again, just to kind of review, and we talked about this before, but I just want to revisit this. Locally, South Texas, we're looking at losing our grasses, but more importantly, becoming less vegetated, possibly 20% less vegetated in that neighborhood, which is a big reduction in entire food webs. So to kind of put a cartoon, a sort of image to this, in the cool, wet areas like this Mississippi site, Grande, Mississippi, where there are no mangroves, there's grass dominance. And as you get warmer and a little bit drier, you start to see mangroves. You cross that threshold, and all of a sudden you look kind of like Mission Aransas. You have mangrove dominance, you have succulents in the upland, and you have some grasses. They're not super common, maybe Spartina, again on the seaward side of the mangroves. And then if you get drier and warmer still, you look like Laguna Atascosa, places in the lower Laguna Madre. You have fewer mangroves, they're smaller, you have smaller patches of succulents, and you have more areas of algae mats, including some just bare mudflats in this intertidal zone, the area between sort of one tidal range and two, because that's where salt accumulates. So this is sort of the pattern we see around, and this is kind of the trend that most parts of the world are going to take. So what's going to happen in the lower Laguna Madre? This is the picture from the title slide, and this is a great example of this. It's just the photo representation of what we saw. A few succulents along the water, mangroves, a relatively narrow fringe, followed by a whole bunch of algae mats, leading into upland with some grassy hills, and then you get yucca and things like that. So this is the photo version of this bottom cartoon here, okay? So if we get drier still, I think what's most likely to happen based on where these plants are distributed and what the salinity profile is along these coastal wetlands, what's likely to happen is that all of the existing plant communities are going to get pinched. We'll probably lose all of our cordgrass. All that intertidal vegetation like mangroves and some of the succulents are going to get pinched. They're going to become narrower and they're probably going to become shorter. We'll probably end up with more mudflats, although it might just be more more algae mats, although it might be too salty even for algae mats. You might have more just mud, and then possibly a pinching on the upland side as well. Okay, that vegetation may be pushed back. So in this picture, hopefully worth 1,000 words in terms of what the sort of structure of these communities might look like. Okay, and again, how is this going to affect people? What does this mean for you and me in our neighborhoods and our coastal communities? Well, let me impress upon you that the types and the amounts of plants govern the types and the amounts of ecosystem services that land provides. So when we see changes in plant community structure, like what we just talked about, shifts to mangroves, loss in vegetation, things like that, we see changes in the types and the amounts of goods and services that the coastal wetlands can provide. And this is the same slide as before, just to remind you, all of these valuable ecosystem services that are at stake. Fewer smaller trees and less vegetation means less storm protection, less erosion reduction across the board, less habitat, less individuals because there's less food for them. We can't support the same kind of fisheries. We won't be able to clean water as well. Hopefully this doesn't impact our recreation ecotourism so much. And we won't be able to store as much carbon. That's a big deal too, looking long term. So this is important. This has very profound, real impacts locally. And we need to work hard to do something about it. We need to take this seriously. There's a lot riding on our ability to save these wetlands. Putting some dollars and cents to this, this is long and I'm way over time, and thank you for your patience. I just want to point out that on a per unit area basis, wetlands are valued at, coastal wetlands are valued at almost $5 million per square kilometer per year. Leave them alone, don't do anything, just let wetlands be wetlands. They generate goods for humans worth $5 million per square kilometer. That's 10 times this, using the same methods, the estimated value of tropical rainforests. And that's a big deal. We know tropical rainforests are fabulous, amazing things. But man, we've got real gems in our own backyard. These coastal wetlands are incredibly valuable. It's because they do so much for us in terms of ecosystem services. So I really don't have time to go into my future work. Basically, we're testing this experimentally. Multiple field sites. Invite me again for another talk. We're catching and moving rain. We're doing it across the South Texas coast. I know I keep talking about why the South Texas coast is important, but it really is, and that's one of the reasons I moved here from East Texas. So not really that big of a move, but and we're changing rainfall. We have predictions, and we've been doing this. We had a sea grant. We built these things. That's Jim's in this picture, right? You guys know Jim Stilley. I was working too. I didn't just have my grad students move all the heavy stuff. So we built these structures. We literally caught rain and moved it around. That project actually just wrapped. We were hoping that Sea Grant term ended. We were hoping to be able to run it another year and do some more transplanting experiments. Did not fly with coronavirus this year. So if the structures are relatively intact, we might be able to jumpstart it and have some more data collection. But we have 2 years of data collection that I'm currently analyzing. But 2 years is not a very long climate change experiment. So the jury's out as to whether we're going to really see the patterns we expected. We'll see. So stay tuned for the next time. I have a boatload of people to acknowledge and thanks for all of this work and participation. When you visit that many refuges and sites, you have this is a far from complete list. And so I want to thank everybody who contributed to this work. And if we have any time for questions, we have -3 minutes for questions or -13 minutes for questions,
Well,
really. I'm happy to field them, anyone who's still here.
Yeah, are you willing to stay on a couple extra minutes and answer?
I certainly am. I don't know if anybody else is. Looks like we still have 54, 53. That's great. Thank you very much, everybody, for toughing it out and listening to all that bad news I had.
Yeah, I mean, we got a question pretty early on, so I will give it to you.
I'm going to stop sharing now.
Okay, well, you can still share your screen if that helps you answer questions. It might.
If there's a question that I can answer by pulling up a slide, I'll do that.
Okay. Yeah, so we had a question early on that said prehistory sea levels have been as much as 60 or 70 feet above current levels. CO2 levels have been significantly higher than presently. What hubris coerces us to believe that we controlled environmental changes? That is a big question, and I will...
That's an excellent question, and it is one that I don't have slides on to answer, but I could find them. So you mentioned 2 things. You mentioned times when sea level was 60 or 70 feet above current levels, and times when CO2 levels were significantly higher than presently. Those events correspond. When CO2 was much higher, so was sea level. There's a connection between these for the reasons I attempted to mechanistically explain. So what makes us believe that we can control these environmental changes is the fact that if you look at the last 100 years, we see it. We see that we are. There is such a close connection between the Industrial Revolution and the changes we have made in CO2 levels that it is the best and not the only way to explain the corresponding changes we've seen in climate. But other things like solar flares, sun effects, anomalies in the Earth's orbit, changes in geothermal patterns, changes in volcanism. All of these things affect climate. And they're things we're studying very carefully. And we can measure those things and measure their effects as well. And if we factor in all of those things, changes in solar activity, volcanism, et cetera, we can predict the expected change we would see in climate. And it falls far short of the change we've seen. The only way the observations we've made in the past 100 years match the actual change in climate that we've seen is if we include human-induced changes to the atmosphere. We know how much CO2 we've put in the atmosphere within a margin of error, but we can measure that. We can tell. We can use stable isotope analysis to look at the actual carbon in the atmosphere and tell conclusively, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that that carbon came from burning fossil fuels. And we can look at how much of that carbon has that signature, and we can tell that it matches with the idea that these changes in carbon production, carbon dioxide emission from the Industrial Revolution is the answer. So let me pull, now I was going to pull up that one slide where you look at this, that climb in CO2 from 1980 to 2020. I can show a longer term graph that has to do with where the Industrial Revolution happened, and it maps well. As best as we can measure it, it doesn't make sense unless we include human impacts, and when we do, everything fits. That's a long answer to this question, but that's a really important question. That's a great question that I'm glad to answer. And if you'd like deeper answers, let me know. I can pull more resources for you. We should probably move on.
Yes, I don't see any other questions, but if anyone has any other quick questions that we could answer, just quickly put in the chat. Dr. Gabler, if you're okay with it, I can put down your email or something, because we are.
Yeah, absolutely. That's all public. I'm a state employee, so
yeah, have people contact you directly, just because we're a little bit over time. I'll just share my screen real quick and then let everyone go.
I'm really excited and thankful that so many people have stayed this long, and thank you for the question. Really, I'll gladly field more if anyone wants to contact me.
Okay.
What about methane? I can answer that if anyone wants to hear.
Go ahead really quickly if you're able to. I just don't want to keep people too long, but go ahead if you'd like to answer that question.
Yeah, let me see here. Let me see if I can pull up a particular file from my computer.
Yeah, I can.
So the long and short of it is, and I'll tell you verbally, methane is a big deal too. Methane is a very strong greenhouse gas. Cattle are only as abundant as they are in the world because of humanity. I mean, we've really, there's orders of magnitude more cattle than there would have been because humans grow them for food. Methane is, per unit mass, a stronger greenhouse gas than CO2. But there's so much more CO2 than there is methane that it is the overriding factor. But methane's up there. Methane also doesn't persist. Methane will break down in the atmosphere on a scale of about 30 to 60 years. So methane is less of a long-term threat than are other factors. But the atmospheric chemists and physicists in the world, and I'm a climate scientist, but I'm not that flavor of climate scientist. They can tell the expected, they call it forcings, atmospheric forcings, to do with certain concentrations of different compounds. And there's also the nitrous oxides, and there are chlorofluorocarbons. There are a lot of other compounds that affect this. Methane's kind of number two after carbon dioxide. And we can measure the actual change that we expect based on concentrations and experiments in controlled environments where we know that a certain amount of methane affects a certain amount of infrared heat trapping. And we can extrapolate that to how much climate change we would expect given the amount of methane in the atmosphere. And it's a small fraction, it's dwarfed by CO2. But again, cattle is also a human impact. Great question.
Yeah, thank you for answering that pretty quick. I think we'll just end questions for now, and I'll give them your
Okay.
email when I follow up with them after this. But I just want to thank everyone for attending this event, and hopefully you learned something new. Thank you again, Dr. Gabler, for your presentation. It was really engaging. And I encourage you to donate to the Bahia Grande Fund with the Friends of Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge if you are able to. Every bit really helps for this overlook, and it will directly help people access the Bahia Grande unit. Our next presentation and the final in the Bahia Grande series is going to be on August 27th at 7 p.m. with Roy Olbari. And he is a fish biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, specifically with the Texas Fish and Wildlife Conservation Office. So that should be really interesting, and make sure to check that out. Thanks again, and hopefully you had a great time.